We're delighted you could join us for tonight's special programming. I'm Dr. Jonathan Erlin. I'm the History of Medicine Librarian in the Health Science Library System and the Secretary Treasurer of the C.F. Reynolds Medical History Society. Wear both hats tonight. This is our second lecture focusing on the fascinating traveling exhibit from the National Library of Medicine's History of Medicine Division. This exhibit is entitled From DNA to Beer, Harvesting Nature in Medicine and Industry. It's on display on the main floor inside of the Falk Library of the Health Sciences. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Jamie Johnston, who certainly second, third, and fourth year medical students all know. I don't think first years know him yet. They will. Dr. Johnston earned his undergraduate degree from Penn State University, then came to the University of Pittsburgh, where he got his MD degree, did his residency training, and he finished up with a research clinical fellowship at Harvard University, working at the prestigious Brigham and Williams Hospital in Boston. His publications and teaching awards would take up the rest of the evening if I started the list. If anybody's curious, email me, I'll send them on to you. They go on forever. He is currently Director of Clinical Services Renal Electrolyte Division, Director of the Nephrology Training Program, Director of the Academy of Master Educators, as well as being in charge of the second year medical students curriculum here at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. His talk tonight is entitled, a word I will not try to pronounce, a case study, The Promise and Perils of Harvesting Nature. Dr. Johnson.
Well, John, I'd like to thank you. That was extraordinarily kind. The talk tonight is Erythropoeitin, and it's easier to say than it is to spell. This is a lot of vowels in a row. In nephrology, we call it EBO, and I think we'll probably call it that the rest of the evening because it's a lot easier than saying erythropoietin. Tonight's talk is going to be divided up into three parts. I'm going to do a little bit of history in regards to blood as a harbor for bad humors, which in many cases it still is. We're plasma freezing a patient right now and removing an antibody, which is just another name for a bad humor. But the ideal then was to get rid of the bad. Blood transfusion, which we finally came around to replacing the bad with the good. And then finally the last concept, which was erythropoietin, which was really to make the good, and then the consequences of what's happened to making the good in the modern world. So before we had writing a long time ago, we really had no knowledge about what people thought about arteries and veins, but certainly they must have butchered things to know that if you bled something out, it died, and certainly that blood was an important concept. In the ancient Greek tradition, whenever we started to get writing, recorded a lot by Galen for the medical tradition, there was the idea of Pneuma, which was a form of circulating air that was necessary for vital organs to function. And Hippocrates and his disciples added to that the concept of vital heat, which they thought was necessary for life. The vital heat was produced by the heart. The heart was considered to be the center of being, thought to also be the center of thought. And that the vital heat was maintained by Pneuma. And Pneuma is really an interesting idea. It comes from the Greek and it gets translated in a lot of different ways. It gets translated as breath, it gets translated as air or wind, but it can also be translated as soul or spirit. And sometimes Pneuma in a single sentence in one place is translated as breath, and another part of the sentence is translated as soul or spirit. So there was a little bit more than this was just something that was there. It was also something that was vital, inherent, if you will, the soul of a person was in their blood. About 300 years before the Christian era, Praxagoras, also of Kos, same place as Hippocrates, had discovered there was a difference between arteries and veins by observing corpses. When you die, your capacitance vessels, the veins, take up all the blood, and the muscular layers of the blood flows out, and it leaves the arteries empty. And therefore, the logical conclusion, at least 300 years before the Christian era, was that these must be full of air, or pneuma, and therefore the heart pumped pneuma around, and the liver made blood, and basically burned in the heart itself. And they really thought that pneuma was carried in these arteries. The belief that pneuma circulated in arteries lasted for about 400 years until Galen came along and with his experience looking at butchered gladiators, basically found that the arteries and the veins both carried blood. And he took this one step further and said, well, Praxagoras wasn't really right, that instead of there being air in the arteries, there was actually blood, and it was infused with vital spirit and pneuma. And by that time as well, the idea of the four humors had been entrenched. So to give you an idea about the power of blood at this time, in the gladiatorial games, it was considered to be acceptable to clamber out into the gladiatorial ring and drink the blood of the gladiators. So because if you drank their blood, you gained their vital spirit, you gained their strength. And this was something that got so bad that one of the later Roman emperors had to ban the practice because people were clamoring so much to go out and drink the blood of gladiators that they were hurting themselves. But this concept that blood can endow you with characteristics persists to this day. Last week I had a patient in clinic that told me that she'd gotten a kidney from a young man, and the young man, she found out through discussing with the family, had a certain predilection for eating M&Ms. And now since her transplant, she can't stay away from M&Ms. Usually what I tell my patients is that if they're a woman and they get a man's kidney, that they will now have to stand up to pee. But none of them have yet told me that they have to do that. Moving along, and this whole concept of air and pneuma into the vein, bleeding is referred to in this particular drawing as breathing of vein. And what you see here is the phlebotomist, the surgeon, breathing the vein, removing the blood. And blood was considered to be the spring humor. It was full of heat and humidity. And if you were febrile, it was because your blood was too hot, and if you bled them, it reduced the heat. And the other thing about bleeding, the other humors were purged, or either by vomiting or by inducing diarrhea, or getting lymphatic fluid through the skin with cupping. But if you remove blood, you also remove the bad humors that were commingled with it. And because of this, the humoral hypothesis, bleeding became the method of choice for maintaining health. Now, the Galenic Beliefs stayed around for a long time. If you look in the literature, bleeding and bloodletting is considered to be the oldest and most persistent surgical procedure that we have. And the humoral concepts, I would argue, still continue this day, but we just have different names for our humors. Instead of, black bile or yellow bile, now it's toxins from bacterial cell walls and things along that line. And the bloodletting for disease mitigated a long time as well. As a matter of fact, if you go down to number 177 Grant Street here in Pittsburgh, PA, you can be cupped and leached. And 2 weeks ago, I saw medicinal leeches being used down at McGee Women's Hospital for an engorged part of the body, and they were putting the leeches on. One of my fellows got very freaked out because the one leech had lost interest in sucking the blood out. I'm sorry, Julia's like looking at me like, oh my God. The one leech had lost interest and was crawling around the patient's bed, and she was afraid to pick up the leech. So we still do it. There are actually diseases as well that we bloodlet for these days. So hemochromatosis we bloodlet for. Some of the iron overload symptoms, polycythemia vera, which is an overproduction of red cells, we still bleed for. So we're still doing this, guys. It's still something that persists from way beyond. So what I'm going to do now is to go into some of the change in paradigm. We've gone from letting out the bad. There are prescriptions about taking in blood to replace the good, which go back as far as Leviticus, where the life of the animal is in the blood, and therefore you are not allowed to drink this sacred substance and ingest it. But things started to change in the Renaissance, and one of the reasons they started to change was what I call Galenic Erosion, which really started with Vesalius, Paracelsus, and Harvey. And basically what you had was empiricism and observational science came back, which if you think about it really isn't Galenic erosion. It's just people saying, well, Galen said observe anyway, so why don't we start doing it again? And then they found out that things weren't exactly like the ancients had reported. So that was the Renaissance. This Greek philosophy was rejuvenated. But what they found was whenever they experimented, that they were getting results that were different than what the ancients had predicted. And so in the 17th century, this came into full blossom. And John probably recognized this book because this book was down in the glass cabinet on the second floor. When I got charged of doing this, I couldn't resist it, so I bought it and so forth. And it's an absolutely fascinating book about the Parisian doctor who made blood transfusion possible. But what he says in the book was that this was a tentative dawn of a new freedom, and that every idea should be tested by experiment. It wasn't exactly the scientific method, that was just being born, but it was pretty good. So the first steps in turning of replacing the bad with the good start with somebody that we really don't think of as being an anatomist or a physician or anything like that. And most of you may remember this picture from World War II of St. Paul's Cathedral during the London Blitz. And what a great symbol of hope this was, because London was being bombed and yet St. Paul's Cathedral still stood there. And it was a real testimony, I think, to the British people. This is St. Paul's Cathedral today with a much happier sky. And this is the man that designed it. It's Christopher Wren, who really was a polymath. He was pretty good at just about everything that he did. His lifelong passions were anatomy and astronomy, and he considered architecture as a sideline interest, despite the fact that there's 30 buildings in London that were designed by him and considered to be some of the greatest pieces of architecture from that period. He worked with Robert Boyle. Most of us know Robert Boyle as being the guy that came up with the ideal gas laws. Well, Boyle was right there with Wren doing anatomy and astronomy. And these two, Boyle and Wren, were two of the founders of the Royal Society in London. They got together, as they were wont to do, Boyle, Wren, and a clergyman scientist by the name of John Wilkins. And Wren had been messing around basically with quills and trying to infuse things into dogs. And what they did during this experiment, after some nice conversation and everything, was they opened the vein on the inner thigh of a dog. They took opium that was mixed with wine and they introduced it into the dog. They were, how shall we say, challenged by the dog's behavior, which now started to stumble around, and bets were made about whether or not the dog would live. Now, the dog did survive the first narcotic overdose, which is interesting, and also recovered. And because he was a famous dog, because he had been operated on by these scientists, everybody fed him, he recovered. He became quite fat and famous, and he was Boyle's pet until someone later on stole the dog. The scientists at this time frequently did that. If the animals that they were working on survived, they would frequently become their pets. And I'm sure that you're all thinking about what the anti-dissectionists would do these days about that, because there was no anesthesia, they didn't give them a shot of whiskey, picture John Wayne to look at, nothing like that. So they kept these pets, but the time moved on. So now we go about 10 years into the future, and this is a physician by the name of Lauer. And in the end of February 1666, in London, he did the first successful transfusion between two animals. And one of the things that he did was he realized the importance of pumping the blood in. So he had a carotid artery. He developed all the cannulae. He started out with simple tubes and progressed to silver tubes with different types of quills on the end. And he bled one dog until almost death, and then transfused the blood from the other dog into the first dog. And the first dog lived. Unfortunately, the second dog died. Well, it wasn't a good thing. But very, very happy with this experiment and validated this many, many times in a variety of different ways. And then he came up with about 20 different questions that he wanted to answer. One was, if you take the blood from a large dog and put it into a small dog, does the large dog get big? And if you take something from a dog that is very sweet and kind and gentle and put it into a bulldog, does the bulldog become sweet and kind and gentle? He had these 16 or 20 different things that he wanted to investigate. Now, he benefited by having a good bit of insight about this, and he was one of the very first ones to say that it wasn't humors, but that one animal may live with the blood of another. And he also had the concept that you could transfuse an animal that was in need of blood, and also that if you replaced the corrupt blood, you could possibly cure sick animals. And this was really the first realization you might be able to do that. Now, this could have been just, something that he did in his lonely garret in London, and no one would pay any attention to it. But instead, he had the benefit of working with the secretary and one of the founders of the Royal Society, Henry Oldenburg. Henry Oldenburg was a polylinguist. He spoke many languages fluently. And because of that, he was able to translate all the different works that were coming in from Europe. He wanted to make a lot of money, which was a common thing now and then. And what he decided to do was cash in by publishing the minutes of the society. And he is credited with founding the first peer-reviewed scientific journal in the English world. And that journal was called the Philosophic Transactions of the Royal Society. The first volume that was published included a letter that Oldenburg had obtained from Lauer to Boyle describing the transfusion experiments, along with some notes that Oldenburg had taken during demonstrations at the Royal Society. And then this was mailed out. It went all around England. It sent to dignitaries and scientists in Europe because, this guy was like, hey, the first one's free, and after that you have to pay for them. And basically it came to the attention of Jean-Baptiste Denis in Paris. And Jean-Baptiste Denis is described in Blood and Justice as a very interesting man. He was somebody that really wanted to break into the coterie of famous scientists that existed in Paris at that time. And so he had to do something that was great. He needed to do something that would get people's attention. So he saw the work by Lauer, and in December of 1666 and March 21st of 1667, he reproduced Lauer's work. It was quite bloody at first, and he had a number of unsuccessful experiments, but finally got it right. The next step was he had to do something to catch people's attention. And there was a young boy at that time who had fever, and therefore he had been bled 20 times. And because of the bleeding, his blood count was very, very low, and all he wanted to do was sleep all the time. And everyone was despairing because they thought this boy was going to die. And what Denis did was he used the information he learned from dogs and cows and lambs and transfused a little bit of blood, they think maybe 3 or 4 ounces of sheep's blood, into this young man. He also, because you had to make room for the blood, also bled 3 ounces out of him. But then the most important thing that they did was they quit bleeding him. And needless to say, guess what? He recovered. That Denis interpreted this, that this was a great success, that the sheep blood, whatever quality the sheep blood had done, had fought the child's fever, and therefore he was able to recover. So he continued his experiments. He did another one on a laborer. He got quite angry with the laborer because the laborer was supposed to go home and be monitored closely, but the laborer took the money and went out and got drunk with his friends, and also butchered the lamb that had been used as transfusion. And he didn't die, and he got another transfusion. The guy said he felt great after it, and if he wanted to do it again, he'd be really happy to do that. But he was still looking for recognition, and that came in the form of this particular patient. And my French is bad enough that I'm not going, Malroy. Yeah, my wife is fluent in French. I'm terrible in French. But in 1667. So this patient had a mental illness, a frenzy was what it was called. And he had had this frenzy for about 8 or 9 years, and it was thought to be due to a thwarted love affair. And what they thought was, well, what we'll do is that since he's in this frenzy, we'll take a docile animal like a sheep or a calf, and we'll infuse the blood into him, and therefore he will assume those characteristics. And so what they did was they infused his blood. Now this is with a sheep, but this is purported to be Denis, and the guy getting the blood in, and this is the apparatus to transfuse. And the sheep looks much more, if you'll forgive the expression, sanguine than I thought it would normally be after having its neck open and blood going into this particular individual. And again, they found out that he actually did feel a little bit better. They said, okay, this worked. The second time they did it, the guy complained that he had a huge amount of pain in his arm, quote unquote, a transfusion reaction. It's the very first sign that you get. And then he complained that he had pain in his back, which is the hemolyzed blood going through his kidneys. And then he went and laid down and slept it off. So what happened then was that the guy was still crazy. He'd only had success with the docile blood for a couple days. And Denis set him up to do a third transfusion, which he really did not get accomplished because the patient died. What Denis was doing in Paris right now was very controversial. physicians there at the time were very upset because they're saying, you're taking our leeching business away from us. And what they did was there were 3 of his rivals in the French society that persuaded the wife to have Denis charged with murder. And Denis at this point said that they were all mad and that they were in more of need of a transfusion than the person that he had been treating. Denis did something clever. He countersued and then became the plaintiff in the case. The court decided in Denis' favor, and then they charged the wife with poisoning her husband when it was found out that she had poisoned him with arsenic, and that's why he died. So this is something that's come down through this. Now, this was not going to be something that was just going to go. I mean, basically what happened was the Paris Society of Physicians, who did not like Denis because he was going to take away their business, got together and they banned transfusion. It could only be done in the presence of a French member of the Paris Society of Physicians. That was in 1668. By edict of Parliament in 1678, the French Parliament said you can't do this anymore. The Royal Society in London also backed off. They said, okay, people are dying, we're not going to do this anymore. And no less than Pope Innocent XI in 1679, here looking pretty spiffy in a red vest, decided that he would also ban this. And what happened was that transfusion basically halted for the next 150 years. There were attempts, there were starts and stops. There were things like, well, let's infuse people with milk because milk is a vital nutrient. And basically, when you put milk in blood, it coagulates and people would die. And they would introduce air and they'd get air embolisms. Things didn't go well until, and this is thanks to my wife, who introduced me to this particular man, James, only literary. I mean, we didn't go and visit his grave or anything like that. We did find out about Blondel in London in 1818. He was an obstetrician. I am very proud to say that he trained at the University of Edinburgh, keeping up the Scottish tradition. And he practiced at Guy's Hospital, which at this particular time, if you were going to practice medicine, was the place to be. This is where Richard Bright was. This is where Hodgkin of Hodgkin's lymphoma. This is where Addison of Addison's disease was. This was a really cool place, and he was a contemporary of all of them. He got fairly upset with the fact that women would die of placenta previa or abruptia placenta, and that he couldn't save them. He decided that he was going to try transfusion, but the differences between animals and man was too great. No one knows if he tried transfusing rat blood into lawyers because they're very similar, but we don't know about that. But he would only do human to human. And basically, he would use venous or arterial, and he said you had to go and get the blood into the patient very, very quickly. You couldn't stop because if you did, the blood would clot and you couldn't do it. And he invented 2 devices. This is his gravitometer, which allowed blood to be infused into the vein without air being in it, so people didn't die of air embolism. He did 10 cases, 4 survived. He probably was lucky enough to have 4 people that were universal donors, and they worked out okay. But he was an argumentative sort, and like other people, like John Hunter, who would frequently arguing with hospital administration, and actually the hospital administration killed John Hunter. He had a heart attack in an argument with the board of directors, not at Guy's. But this gentleman, Blondel, did have a lot of problems with the administration, and especially the secretary-treasurer, and he resigned because of this dispute. Now, don't feel too bad for Blondel. He later on was prominent enough that he got into the Royal College of Physicians 2 years later. He set up a private practice, and he ended up going to the outskirts of London in private practice. He had a very weird rounding schedule. He would sleep until midday. Dr. Fruchello will appreciate this. He would get up about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, see patients in his house, then go, always with a book in hand, and see patients out in their homes until about 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and then would wash, rinse, repeat, and do it over again. He had a tidy little estate on one of the squares, and he died with a fortune at that time of 500,000 pounds, which today translates into 120 million pounds. So this guy was well off when he died. So don't feel too sorry for Blondel. Oops, let me go back here. So transfusion, basically we're going to skip over what happened over the start, stop, because the problems that they kept running into was incompatible blood. they didn't know about cross-matching, which was left to line standard to discover, where he got the first 3 blood types, A, O, and B, and then later on, a year later, got AB. And then Lewison, who invented an effective anticoagulant at that time, which was sodium citrate. And if you go back to one of my talks about dialysis, anticoagulation of the blood was very, very important. I wish we would have known in nephrology about sodium citrate, because we were using extract of leech head as our anticoagulant, which now has been recombinant DNA made into Herudin. But this would have been a godsend for us. It binds to calcium, and when you bind the calcium, the blood won't clot. This led to, there was a donor society that was formed in London in 1921, and then the first blood bank, which interestingly enough was in Spain in 1936. And then this became standard procedure in 2015. The demand for blood products has not ceased. I'm old enough to remember the old liver transplants here, where we would use 150 units of blood during one transfusion. We would wipe out the blood bank. And then we invented a clever little tool called a cell saver, which basically we would bypass the heart. We would take any blood that was sucked out of the field, and we would filter that and then return it to the patient. Nice little procedure, really cut down blood use a lot. But we use more blood by transfusion these days than we ever have. The demand keeps going up and up and up. There are some consequences of transfusion. Iron overload syndromes. In my patients, I'm old enough to remember when they got hemochromatosis. This is a normal hand, and this is a patient with hemochromatosis. This is called bronzing. This is very characteristic of iron storage diseases. In my dialysis patients, some of them would get this bronze, but some of them would look like a bruise that was several days old, and they would have this yellowish green color to their skin. So that I could walk into a room like this and go down the aisle, and I could point out the patients just by looking at their skin color before 1989 who had iron overload due to their transfusions. The other thing was transmission of disease, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV. And these have gone down in risk quite a bit. We're now a 1 in a million chance of getting these. But if you have somebody that contracted B, C, or HIV, they have a window of opportunity where they have not formed the antibody. So you're still at risk, and that's led to the technique of auto-transfusion, banking your own blood, and then having that transfused during the operation. So the search for another way. Bright and Christensen did not think of transfusion at that particular time, but they were very good observational scientists. And one of the things that they noticed was that there was anemia associated with kidney disease. Bright, who can be credited with writing the very first medical paper that combined clinical exam, pathology, and analysis of blood products, and came up with Bright's disease, which was chronic streptococcal glomerulonephritis, also was a keen observer of his patients and noticed how anemic or how pale his patients were. Christensen took it one step further and was able to associate the fibrotic changes in the kidney with the anemia in the patient, and said that there was no other disease as severe as kidney disease in terms of the effect that it had on blood counts. You got the lowest blood counts with this disease than any other disease. So things continue, and now people start to make observations. This is 1878. This is Jourdain and Bert, his associate. Jourdain was a French scientist. He was wealthy. He had enough money to spend a lot of time in Mexico. And one of the things that he noticed was in his observations that if you were anemic, you were weak and pale and you didn't feel very good. And that if you had mountain sickness, you were weak and pale and didn't feel very good. It made the connection between anemia and mountain sickness is that this was due to hypoxia. And he supplied Bert with the money to make some equipment to re-oxygenate people at the time. Bert always gives Jourdain the credit for this. So again, we now come down to 1890, just a few years later, and Francois Viault, another physician from Paris, he spent 3 weeks in Peru, and much the same as Hank Bonson did. Hank Bonson was part of the team that climbed Everest, and he got up so far into base camp. And he took blood samples all the way to study the effects of altitude on physiologic parameters. Viault did the same thing, took his blood count, and then after he got down from 13,000 feet in the air in Peru, he took it again and noticed that he had become erythrocytotic. his his red cell count had increased by 60%. And the ability of this really fascinated him. There was something about hypoxia that could make you go and stimulate blood formation. They started looking for the factor. This is Carnot and his assistant, Deflandre. They bled a rabbit, and they took that rabbit after it was anemic, and they took the plasma from that, and they put it into a regular rabbit, and what they showed was blood production increased. And so what they showed from this is the coining of the term hematopoietin, the generic term for a factor in the blood that increased blood cell counts. And that started really a whole line of different things. We're going to skip ahead. This is Alan Erslev. He confirmed that red cells stimulated activity in anemic blood in 1953. He was a Dane. He spent his training in New York and Boston, and finally ended up at an institute in Jefferson, where he continued to investigate this agent for the rest of his life. An assay was developed for this in 1955 by Pizak, and then a breakthrough at the University of Chicago in 1957 by Leon Jacobson and Eugene Goldwasser, because they identified that the kidneys were the source of erythropoietin. And the way that they did that sounds a little bit barbaric. They went in and they took out organs and looked to see what happened to blood counts. And they had the greatest effect whenever they took out the kidneys. So making an animal anephric basically took away all the erythropoietin. We'll give the liver a little credit. The liver does make a little bit of erythropoietin, but it's the kidney that makes most of it. Well, Eugene Goldwasser now spent the next 14 years trying to isolate this substance. 14 years. He finally isolated a very, very small amount of this from the plasma of anemic sheep. Then he ended up collaborating with Takashi Miyake, who came to him with a very elaborately wrapped, as only the Japanese can do, package that contained the dried distillate of 2,500 liters of urine from patients in Japan that had aplastic anemia. And from that, they got 8 milligrams of this substance, of erythropoietin. Think about that. This looks like a really good industrial project, right? You just go, you have everybody pee, and then you take the urine and you just mass condense it, and then you isolate it. 2,500 liters for 8 milligrams doesn't seem like a good production scheme. And that's pretty much what Goldwasser thought as well. So this was impractical, and what Goldwasser did was he applied for a patent and then promptly forgot about it. He promptly forgot about it. He never followed up on it, didn't do anything. He was able, with this very tiny amount, to establish the amino acid sequence of the substance. And there was a little company around there called Applied Molecular Genetics. And they were poor. I mean, they didn't have very much money. So they got about $40 million from Johnson & Johnson as, of course, seed money. They gave the amino acid sequence. They were able to get the genetic code from that. They were able to identify the gene, because after all, this isn't related to DNA. They finally got there, guys, okay? And they cloned it. And now they have the gene. So this little company that we've been talking about is Amgen, okay? And they started this process with money from Johnson & Johnson, who they're still trying to shaft, despite their patent agreements and everything. And they inserted this gene into Chinese hamster ovary cells. Now, I had never heard of Chinese hamster ovary cells until I started working with EPO as a research project. So I had to look up what a Chinese hamster looks like, and this is what they look like. Now, they take these cells and they keep them in culture, and what they're able to do is they're able to mass produce erythropoietin using recombinant DNA technology, all because of this little guy. Okay. Insulin, they use E. coli, they use different cell lines for different things. So now the question is, did it work? And they sent it off to Pacific Northwest, to the Northwest dialysis units up there, and they gave it to a patient. And this patient had been severely anemic. Patients with end-stage renal disease can get down to hemoglobins of 4. You know, I hope most of us in the room have hemoglobins that are around, 13 to 14. But he would get a transfusion. Red cell half-life in patients with kidney disease is decreased by 50%. So instead of the red cells lasting 120 days, they last 60 days. And they're not making any red cells. So he gets transfused, his hemoglobin goes up, it goes down, up, down, up, down. All the iron's staying behind. His iron stores are going way up. The iron's getting deposited in his liver and his heart. He's getting congestive heart failure, liver failure. And then, lo and behold, what they do is they give him EPO. They have no idea what the dose is. Absolutely no clue. It's like whenever we started using tacrolimus here, we had no idea what dose to use. And this happens. Blood count doesn't go down. Blood count goes up and up and up. And then finally they established this level, and it persisted as long as they gave him the EPO. As a kidney doctor that's having to use a lot of blood and everything, when I saw these data, it was pretty much like someone had invented insulin. Okay, this was just absolutely breathtaking. We did a study here. Beth Carreno was the driving force behind it. I collaborated on the study. We did the very first study of using EPO in patients on peritoneal dialysis, proof of concept. We knew this stuff worked. We knew that in June of 1989, the FDA was going to approve it. We knew that this was going to be a blockbuster drug. So what do you think I did with my investment portfolio? Absolutely nothing, okay, because it would have been insider trading, it would have been highly unethical. So that's why I still work for a living, okay? So this was just absolutely amazing what this did in our industry. Transfusions dropped by 90%. 90%. And 70 to 90% of our patients that were receiving the EPO said they felt better, they slept better, their sexual function was better, their well-being, and they had reduced cold intolerance. We got the reports back, they were absolutely amazing. So patients really, really appreciated this. Now we get into a little bit of the perils of biotechnology. So the government, as you may know, the end-stage renal disease program is entirely supported by Medicare. It's about $46 billion this year of money that goes to it. The government initially thought it would be $500 million, 50,000 patients. It's $46 billion and about 550,000 patients. Probably be about 2 million by 2030. So it's big bucks. Well, what they did was they reimbursed us for using it. So we had what we call a facility fee. We give it, and basically they did $40 per dose. Didn't matter what the dose was. And, you gave 5,000, you gave 10,000 units, it didn't matter. They gave you $40 a dose. So there's not much financial incentive here. And so by about this time, we've done a little bit. We decreased transfusions a lot, but we really didn't see anything. And then the government changed the reimbursement policy. Now what we did, if we gave 1,000 units to a patient, they gave us $11. Okay, that's pretty good, like that, okay? So, our patients are generally getting about 15,000 units a week. This is a little bit of change right here. So look what happens whenever you put the profit motive into this. All of a sudden, EPO takes off in its usage. 445,000 or 4,500, 4,000, and so forth. And by 1993, we're up to this as an average daily dose given to the patients on the dialysis Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And this now becomes a cost center for dialysis units. They're making a lot of money off this. So they want to give a lot of EPO. And they continue to do this through the next decade and into the early part of this century. The dialysis deaths, it looked like they were actually improving, so it didn't look like we were hurting anybody. And we kept ramping up the hemoglobin. We really had no idea how high the hemoglobin should be. We had none. We knew that if we changed the hemoglobin a little bit too quickly, that the patients could have high blood pressure, and that would be a bad thing. But, it's like more EPO, more EPO, more EPO, until we were getting the hemoglobins up on average. Now, this is quite a range for hemoglobins. So this is going to probably vary from 10.5 up to about 13.5 up into the normal range. And basically, like most people, life is good, and if a little is good, a lot's got to be a lot better. So let's say let's normalize the hemoglobin for everybody, because dialysis patients should all have a normal hemoglobin. And what we did, and this is a study that was done by Bessarab, this is from the New England Journal of Medicine. This was funded by Amgen, so you got to give them props for doing this. They said, okay, this is going to be our low hemoglobin group, and this is going to be our normal hematocrit group. And what you see on this axis is the probability of death or myocardial infarction. And guys, the normal hematocrit group doesn't look so good. So what we found was that if we normalize this, we cause more blood pressure problems, more thrombosis, more heart attacks, and more death by trying to normalize the parameter, whereas the low hematocrit group did a lot better. So the paradigm from this is what's normal for normal is not normal for somebody with a chronic disease. You might have diabetes and you say, okay, I'm going to try to get my hemoglobin A1C as good as possible. The goal is 7. Well, when you get below 7, one of the things that you see with this particular disease is you may get some benefit, but you also get increased risk, and your chance of dying with diabetes is a lot greater if your hemoglobin A1C is less than 7. So things get worse. Okay, this is now 2 articles back to back in the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm not going to tell you what these mean because I don't remember. Well, one's called the Choir trial, that's how we talk about it, and the other one's called the Create trial. And they ran one group high and one group lower, and the higher group, 48% higher in the high hemoglobin group, not at significance. Congestive heart failure, also higher in the high hemoglobin group, but not at significance. And lo and behold, the data that Amgen had given us about quality of life didn't bear out at all. They saw no improvement in quality of life at the higher hemoglobins. And the news gets worse. Well, the Create study showed exactly the same thing, by the way. They also found out that they were giving this erythroid-stimulating agents to people that had anemia associated with cancer because they get anemic and they should feel better too. And what they found was that in particular, this condition, they were getting red cell aplasia. They were actually wiping out the bone marrow so that people didn't make red cells. This turned out to be a manufacturing defect. There was something wrong with the EPO that caused this. Okay, we can accept that. That was a manufacturing error. That's not a good thing. Someone needed to be fired because of that. But then they found out that when EPO was used to treat anemia due to cancer, that the head and neck cancers got worse. And then they found out that the breast cancers got worse. And then they started looking at the cancer cells, and they found out the cancer cells have erythropoietin receptors. Erythropoietin is a growth factor. It stimulates things to grow. So that if you give it to people that have cancer, you're going to make their cancer worse. This was not good. They finally, in the Lancet in 2007, they did a meta-analysis, 255 papers, about 120 abstracts. The meta-analysis on this whisker plot shows that the problem with getting thrombosis is increased by about 35% if you have an access. Your blood pressure control is worse by 27%. MI didn't turn out too bad, and all-cause mortality went up by about 17%. So this wonder drug that we were so happy with, like transfusing somebody or bloodletting somebody with the science of the time, turns out we're killing people with it. A wonderful drug that does wonderful things, but because we didn't know how to use it, we didn't know enough about it, this is what happened. So in 2007, this led to this FDA warning, which is pretty doggone. This is a black box warning. Cancer patients' use of erythroid-stimulating agents increased remission or increased progression of head and neck cancer, decreased survival in breast cancer, increased deaths. And if you go above the target level in patients that are receiving chemotherapy, you're okay, but if you're not receiving chemotherapy or radiation therapy, you are not supposed to use it. So this black box warning came out, and EPO use declined. Medical literature was read, and the use of EPO started to go down. We started going more with iron therapy, which makes it more effective. And then one of the things that I'll tell you in passing that's really curious, EPO can be administered by vein, it can be administered intramuscularly, or it can be introduced under the skin. If you give it under the skin, it lasts roughly 9 times as long as an intravenous injection. And also, the dose that you need goes down by about 40%. But because they were making money using larger doses of EPO, and they said, oh, the patients will complain, they didn't switch over to sub-Q until the financial subcutaneous injection until the financial rewards were removed. So let's talk a little bit about Amgen as a business. A $1,000 investment in Amgen in 1984, in 2006, worth $500,000. That's 2006. I couldn't find a comparable piece of data, but I'll be able to show you a little bit of an extrapolation about this. This is now the largest biotech company in the world. And this is their stock, okay? This is back in 1987, stock price is down here in the toilet. And then, well, stock goes up, it splits. It splits again. It splits again, it splits again. And now, okay, it goes up. Sort of has a little bit of a hard time here because people are getting this data about how it's bad for you. Then the Great Recession hits. And look what's happened to this since. So now this is yesterday. This is selling at $148 a share. So your $1,000 that you invested in 1984 is probably worth a cool $1 million right now. And that's just based on the sort of Jamie Johnston lack of economic training extrapolation, but I think it's probably good enough. So other things that happened, and this became very obvious. Who are the two big users of erythroid-stimulating products? Kidney doctors and oncologists. Suddenly, Amgen became very popular at national meetings. They inevitably have the biggest event stall there. They usually are lattes if you want them. You want to go and have your morals for a latte. They were support for divisions. There was support for experts. So high-ranking academics could go out and make $10,000 a pop giving a talk like, they wouldn't let me give this talk, but giving a talk like this and going out. And division chiefs got money as well. They got consulting fees, they got honoraria for speaking. The University of Pittsburgh Medical Center got $1 million for putting a form of EPO on their formulary called Erythropoeitin. Erythropoeitin was invented, Dargopoetin, I'd say that with 10 times fast. Dargopoetin is a modest modification of the erythropoietin molecule. A couple glucoses here, a couple sialic residues here. Oh, I've got a new drug. What's different about it? It lasts longer. You don't have to give it as frequently. Your patients will love it. It was done as a marketing scheme because EPO was coming off patent. And they had to compete with Johnson & Johnson, who were making EPO, but didn't have the patent for Erythropoeitin because Amgen said that's ours, and they kept it. So this was all marketing. So just to see who's making the guidelines for the EPO, this goes back to when the reform started. The Central Medicare and Medicaid System, CMS, people that run Medicare and Medicaid, their EPO monitoring policy group had 24 members, 75% who had financial associations with Amgen or Johnson & Johnson. So the foxes are in the henhouse, guys. Okay? The National Kidney Foundation, this is a nonprofit thing for patients. They come up with the Dialysis Outcome and Quality Improvement Study. 15 out of 21 in the work group had ties to industry. The American Kidney Fund, Amgen funds a clinical fellowship program. So these guys were really into our pockets. Pete Stark, who I miss quite a bit, had a hearing, patient safety and quality issues on December 6th. Almost $20 million at that time in corporate donation from their platinum friends, Amgen and DaVita. It's a cozy club, isn't it? So, now you may think, okay, the government moved in, took care of all this stuff, gun control, oh, I'm sorry, I should bring that up. And basically in 2012, they finally got some teeth. And Amgen was forced to pay $762 million in criminal penalties because what they were doing is pursuing profits at the risk of patient safety. And the way that they were doing this is, remember Erythropoeitin, the slightly modified chemical? They were promoting it to treat cancer patients not undergoing chemotherapy. And this is a strict off-label use that kills patients. Amgen's own study showed that this increased the chance of death, and yet they pushed this. This is from the New York Times, 2012. And oh, you know, it gets any better. Oh my, Amgen's losing money. What shall we do? They're going to go bankrupt. $762 million represents less than 5% of Amgen's yearly revenues. Talk about a slap in the hand, okay? Well, there was this fiscal cliff bill, you remember from a couple years ago, where we were all going to fall off the fiscal cliff and government was going to stop. So what they did was they put a rider on this that allowed Amgen to evade Medicare cost-cutting controls. And it delayed the price restraints that were putting on the drug classes that were used for dialysis. Just one, Cinacalcet, which we use all the time, it's wonderful for secondary hyperparathyroidism, made by Amgen, Sensipar is the brand name. A 30-day supply of Sensipar costs $1,600. So they're not going to miss a dime of the money they pay for the criminal penalties, because what they're going to do is they're going to make it up because they got this 2-year window where they can sell their product at exorbitant prices. Again, the peril of one of our modern technologies. Not the technology, but the way that it's used and abused. Just to get into the details about this, these contributions from Amgen employees in their PAC. So Max Baucus, a Democrat from Montana, he got $68,000 from Amgen. Orrin Hatch, $59,000 from Amgen. Mitch McConnell, you may remember him, now our majority leader in the Senate, he got $73,000. And oh, by the way, the 2 lobbyists that were speaking with Mr. Baucus and Mr. McConnell were their former chiefs of staff, who are now working in Washington. So this is one of the ways why your medications cost so much money. It's because of this wheeling and dealing. The total Medicare spending for injectables, again, you see rise, this particular part of the slide, up to about $2 billion a year. It leveled off whenever people started reading the data. And the other thing that happened was people started getting more iron to make up for that, and they also switched to sub-Q use. So it leveled off. It is still a major moneymaker. The cost for us, because we pay into Medicare, is erythropoietin is the highest expenditure drug in all of Medicare. More money is spent on erythropoietin than any other drug on the planet. Current sales by EPO, just worldwide sales, are $12 billion. Okay, so they're making a lot of money. And what's happened is the government says enough is enough, and they're now restricting payment. We can't drive the hematocrit higher than 36. If we go over that, they stop paying for the EPO. We have to cut down on our EPO use. And this whole movement started in 2006, but wasn't codified until 2012. So, blood doping, I'm going to finish up because I thought blood doping was going to be the biggest thing I'm talking about, and it's actually Amgen business ethics. Blood doping, we all know about EPO as an athletic performance enhancing drug. First recorded detection was in 2002 at the Salt Lake Olympics. Why did it take so long? Because we had no methodology to detect recombinant EPO in the blood. It's different in our EPO assays that we can't detect it. When did athletes start getting it on the black market? Within the year after it had been approved by the FDA. And one of the major sales revenue sources for Amgen is illegal sales to athletes. And it's used in anything that has endurance, cycling, rowing, boxing, horse racing. You have to give it to horses too, okay? Distance running. On the street, if someone comes home and says, hey, I got some Poe today, don't think they're reading poetry, okay? It's a street name for EPO. Edgar Allan Poe is another name, and Edgar is another name, and Zumo, which is Spanish for juice. Those are all street names for this particular thing. And of course, we all know about Lance Armstrong, the biggest scandal to date. The entire U.S. Postal Service team was in on this. They were all blood doping. As a matter of fact, it was absolutely rampant in cycling. Lance Armstrong has said that if I could go back, I would probably dope again. Now, you realize this is a shocked picture, right? It doesn't really do this. Don't feel too badly for Lance. His net worth is $125 million, and he makes roughly $7.5 million a year. And like most things, there's a yin and yang that goes on in life. He's also raised $500 million for cancer research. So despite the fact that he did this horrendous thing, he's also done a lot of good. It just upsets me because I'm a cyclist, or at least I used to be, I think I was, and he was always one of my idols. So the take-home message today for this talk is that we've talked about bleeding. This is one of 3 photographs that exists of bloodletting. I'm sure they haven't looked at leeches on people these days. Transfusion and a vial of EPO. This little guy right here, that's about $30 for that vial. It's 3,000 units. The thing about every new technology is it has a dark side and a good side, and that we should always proceed with caution and neither be the first nor the last to embrace a new technology. With that, thank you. Sorry I got political at the end, but I feel pretty passionately about this. Any questions for me? Alan?
A number of things. First of all, doping is an extension of legal doping, which is training at high altitude.
Right.
Secondly, is there any connection between androgens and the production of erythropoietin?
Oh, you're going back to for decadurabolin, whenever we had that. So the answer is, the first one is high altitude. Lance Armstrong used to sleep in a low oxygen tent. The Russians, being the Russians, have taken us even further and find out that they can get maximal stimulation of natural ego production by having their athletes inhale a combination of xenon and oxygen. Male hormone.
And we have our Olympic Training Center at Colorado Springs at
Yeah.
8,000 feet for that very reason.
Yeah, but that's legal.
Because that came up after the Mexican Olympics.
So the androgens definitely do have an effect on erythroid production. And we used to use male hormone as a stimulant prior to EBO coming on board to increase blood counts. It's probably one of the reasons why women have the obligate blood loss, and men get their curse whenever they're 50 when our prostates get big, every bush becomes the bathroom. But basically for us, our blood count is also higher because of androgenic stimulation. You can get increased erythrogen or erythropoietin production by the liver as well, but it's not enough to compensate for it.
That is one of the reasons why the blood counts between men and women go up during adolescence.
Right.
Also, recently, there was a report that it's become common to use androgens in elderly people for infants. And the studies showed that actually there's an increased incidence of cardiacs in people who take it at that age.
One thing I didn't mention with the blood doping was that when it first appeared, there were 24 unexplained deaths in bicyclists that were, they didn't know why it happened and suspected they were doping, and they got their blood hematocrit up to about 55. When you get your hematocrit up to about 55, your blood goes from being this nice free-flowing solution to something that sort of looks like cold maple syrup. It gets very viscous, and you get basically coronary underperfusion whenever that happens. So the next step was, is they said, okay, we're going to test everybody, and you can't have a hematocrit greater than 50. So all the athletes blood doped up to a hematocrit of 50. They couldn't do anything about it. It was, oh, we're just following the rules. That's what we're doing. Other questions for me?
Some of the University of Pittsburgh connections with Amgen, the recently stepped down retired CEO is a Pitt MBA graduate, and Senator Orrin Hatch is a Pitt Law School graduate.
Really? Didn't know that. So what was mentioned is that the Amgen CEO.
He's the one who put Amgen on the map. I
Yeah.
forget his name.
Yeah, he started it, and then also Orrin Hatch is a Pitt Law School graduate.
Is there any biosimilar to this protein?
Another protein that's similar to this protein. Most of what we've got have been modest modifications. They go, and basically what they do is they check, or they change sialic acid residues and glucose tails on it. As far as another molecule that will act with the erythropoietin receptor in the marrow, I don't know of any. Believe me, I bet you they're looking for it. Other questions? If not, thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you for your time.